April 14th, 1865, was supposed to be the day the healing began. The Union had won, and Abraham Lincoln was already secretly planning how to bring the South back into the fold with charity for all but a single 44 caliber lead ball from John Wilkes Booth, as Derringer did on Disquillamanit, killed the plan for a peaceful transition. With Lincoln's death, the presidency fell into the hands of Andrew Johnson. Here is the first secret of Reconstruction. Johnson was never meant to be president. He was added to the 1864 ticket as a unity candidate, a Southern Democrat from Tennessee who stayed loyal to the Union. He was a political symbol, a peace offering to the South. But Johnson was not Lincoln. While Lincoln was a master of compromise, Johnson was stubborn, prickly, and most importantly a staunch believer in white supremacy. He believed that while the South shouldn't have left the Union, the right of white Southerners to rule their own states was sacred. While Congress was in its summer recess, Johnson took a secret path to power. He didn't wait for the government to meet. He began issuing pardons to Confederate leaders by the thousands. Imagine fighting a 4-year war to defeat an enemy, only to see that enemy-ous generals and politicians secretly walking back into their old offices just months later. By the time Congress returned in December 1865, the South looked almost exactly as it had before the war. Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, had been elected to the U.S. Senate. The North was outraged. It felt like the blood of 600,000 soldiers had been shed for nothing. But the most chilling hidden change wasn't happening in Washington. It was happening in the state houses of Mississippi, South Carolina, and Alabama. These states began passing the black codes. To the outside world, these looked like labor laws, but the secret purpose was to recreate slavery without the name. Under these codes, if a black man didn't have a written labor contract for the year, he could be arrested for vagrancy. His labor would then be auctioned off to the highest bidder to pay his fine. In some estates, black children could be apprenticed to white masters without their parents' consent. It was a legal trap designed to keep the newly freed population in a state of permanent, unpaid servitude. This was the secret counter-revolution. The South was saying to the North, "You freed them, but we will still own their lives." There was also a secret psychological battle. The South was physically destroyed. Cities like Atlanta and Richmond were piles of brick and ash. But the Southern identity was stronger than ever. They began to craft the secret myth of the lost cause. They argued that the war was a noble struggle for states' rights, and that the enslaved people had been happy under the old system. This wasn't just storytelling. It was a political weapon. By convincing their children that the war was a heroic tragedy rather than a fight to preserve human property, they ensured that the spirit of the Confederacy would survive even if the army was gone. The North watched these developments with a mixture of fear and fury. A group of men in Congress, led by Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, realized that Johnson's secret peace was a disaster. They were radical Republicans. They weren't radical because they wanted to destroy the South. They were radical because they believed in a secret idea that was revolutionary for 1865, that a black man should have the same right to vote, own property, and speak in court as a white man. The tension between Johnson and Congress became so thick you could cut it with a knife. Johnson vetoed every bill meant to help the formerly enslaved. He even vetoed the Civil Rights Act of 1866. The first time in American history a president tried to block basic citizenship rights. This created a government in total deadlock. On one side, you had a president who was secretly siding with the former rebels. On the other, you had a Congress that wanted to punish the rebels and protect the freedmen. This power vacuum allowed the South to radicalize. Violence began to break out in cities like Memphis and New Orleans, where white mobs and police murdered black veterans and citizens in broad daylight. This wasn't just a challenge. It was the collapse of the rule of law. The secret change was that the war hadn't ended. It had just moved from the battlefield to the streets. As 1865 turned into 1866, the North realized they couldn't just wish the South back into the Union. They had to rebuild it from the ground up. This led to the secret decision to place the South under military rule. The United States was about to become an occupying force in its own country. The brewing storm of Reconstruction was now a full-blown hurricane. The secrets of the power vacuum showed that without a strong leader like Lincoln, the wounds of the Civil War would not just stay open, they would fester and turn into a century of conflict. As 1866 turned into 1867, the North reached a breaking point. They looked at the South and saw the same old elites back in power, the same black codes being enforced, and the same atmosphere of defiance. The radical Republicans in Congress decided the time for soft peace was over. They launched a secret takeover of the government, overriding President Johnson's vetoes and seizing control of the nation's destiny. Congress passed the Reconstruction Acts of 1867, which did something unthinkable. They declared these southern state governments illegal. They divided the South into 5 military districts, each ruled by a Union general. This was the secret occupation. For the first time, federal troops were stationed on street corners to protect the voting rights of black men and ensured that the old Confederate leaders could unrig the system. This military presence created a protective bubble. Under the shadow of Union bayonets, the secret revolution of the ballot box began. Thousands of black men, many of whom had been enslaved just 2 years prior, lined up to register to vote. This shift in power was so sudden and so massive that it sent shockwaves through the global political community. While the soldiers kept the peace, an army of teachers and social workers arrived from the north. This was the Freedmen's Bureau. Its hidden change was the creation of a massive educational infrastructure where none had existed. Before the war, it was a crime in many southern states to teach an enslaved person to read. Now, there was a secret thirst for knowledge. Elderly people who had spent 70 years in the fields sat in classrooms next to their grandchildren, all huddled over the same alphabet books. This led to the birth of historically black colleges and universities, HBCUs like Howard, Fisk, and more. The secret weapon of the black community wasn't a gun. It was a book. But the most explosive secret of this era was the issue of land. During the war, General William T. Sherman had issued Special Field Order No Field. It was a radical idea. He secretly set aside a massive strip of coastline from South Carolina to Florida, roughly 400,000 acres to be divided into 40-acre plots for newly freed families. He even offered them old army mules to help plow the land. To the formerly enslaved, this was the secret of true liberty. They understood a fundamental truth. If you don't own the land you walk on, your freedom is a shadow. Thousands of families began building homes and planting crops on these plots. For a brief, shining moment, it looked like the economic foundation of the South was being rebuilt on a basis of fairness and equity. 10K May, the secret betrayal that would haunt the American economy for a century. President Andrew Johnson, using his executive power while Congress was away, began issuing special pardons to wealthy Southern planters. These pardons didn't just forgive their rebellion, they restored their land. Federal agents were sent to the 40-acre plots to tell the black families they had to leave. Imagine the scene. Families who had finally tasted independence were told they had to either work as laborers for their former masters or be a victim. The secret of 40 acres became a secret of heartbreak. This decision ensured that the majority of black Americans would remain landless, creating a cycle of poverty that would last for generations. With no land of their own and no money to buy it, millions of people were forced into a new, hidden economic trap. Sharecropping. The secret of sharecropping was the debt. A planter would provide the land, the seeds, and the tools. The worker would provide the labor. At the end of the year, they would share the crop. However, the planter also ran the local store, where the worker had to buy food and clothes on credit at 50% or 60% interest. When the harvest came, the worker almost always owed the planter more than his share of the crop was worth. He was secretly tied to the land by debt, just as he had been tied by chains. This was the new economy of the South's system, designed to look like a contract, but feel like a prison. The South's old elite didn't just hate the freedmen, they hated the Northerners who came to help. They secretly labeled them carpetbaggers, implying they were low-class opportunists who packed all their belongings into a cheap carpetbag to go south and steal. Southerners who joined the Republican Party were called scalawags, a term for a worthless, diseased horse. The secret tension here was a clash of cultures. The North was trying to force a modern, capitalist, and egalitarian system onto a society that was desperately trying to hold on to its feudal, aristocratic past. The conflict between the radical Congress and President Johnson reached its secret peak in 1868. Congress passed the Tenure of Office Act, a law designed specifically to trap the president. When Johnson fired his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, Congress pounced. For the first time in history, a president was impeached. The secret of the trial was that it was about more than just one cabinet member. It was a trial for the soul of Reconstruction. Johnson survived by a single vote in the Senate, but his power was broken. He was a lame duck, and the radical Republicans had successfully secretly neutered the presidency to push through the 14th Amendment granting full citizenship and equal protection under the law to every person born in the United States. This section of history is a secret because it shows that change was possible. For a few years, the South was the most progressive place in America. Public schools, fair taxes, and civil rights were the law of the land, but beneath the surface, the secret resistance was arming itself. The radical takeover had changed the laws, but it had yet changed the hearts of the men who felt their world had been stolen from them. By 1868, the South was a pressure cooker. On the surface, things looked orderly. There were new state constitutions, black men were serving in legislatures, and Union soldiers patrolled the streets. But beneath that surface, a secret army was forming in the woods and backrooms of the South. This was not a war of armies, but a war of shadows. It was the rise of the invisible empire of the South, and its weapon was pure, calculated terror. The story usually begins in a small law office in Pulaski, Tennessee. In late 1865, 6 former Confederate officers, bored and bitter about their defeat, formed a social club. They called it the Ku Klux Klan, derived from the Greek word kuklos, meaning circle. At first, they wore costumes and played secret pranks, but the hidden change happened quickly. The pranks turned into night riding. They realized that by wearing white sheets and hoods, they could play on the secret fears of the formerly enslaved, pretending to be the ghosts of Confederate soldiers killed at Shiloh or Gettysburg. What began as a club transformed almost overnight into a political terrorist organization. Their secret mission: to destroy the Republican Party in the South and return the black population to a state of total submission. By 1867, the Klan had grown so large, they held a secret convention in Nashville. They appointed Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest as their Grand Wizard. They created a secret constitution called the Prescript, which organized the South into realms, dominions, and provinces. This was a shadow government. While the official state government was Republican, if a black man was too successful as a farmer, the Klan visited him. If a white teacher from the North opened a school for black children, the Klan burned it down. This was a secret tax on progress, paid in blood and fear. The secret of the Klan's success was its anonymity. A man could be your neighbor, your doctor, or even your local sheriff during the day. But at night, he was a hooded executioner. They didn't just kill, they secretly targeted the symbols of freedom. They targeted the Union League's political clubs where black and white Republicans met. In 1870, in Caswell County, North Carolina, a white Republican senator named John Stevens was secretly lured into a room at the courthouse and murdered by Klan members while a trial was happening just floors above. The message was clear. No one, not even a government official, was safe from the invisible empire. Perhaps the most terrifying example of this secret war was the Colfax Massacre of 1873 in Louisiana. Following a disputed election, a white paramilitary group similar to the Klan surrounded the local courthouse held by black defenders. After the black defenders surrendered, the secret militia murdered nearly 150 of them in cold blood. Here is the hidden tragedy of Colfax. When the case went to the Supreme Court, United States v. Cruikshank, the court ruled that the federal government didn't have the power to punish individuals for violating the rights of others. Only states could do that. Since the southern states were the ones committing the violence, this secret legal ruling effectively gave a green light to domestic terrorism for the next 80 years. But the Klan met its match in Ulysses S. Grant. Grant, the man who crushed Robert E. Lee, viewed the Klan as a second rebellion. In 1871, he secretly worked with Congress to pass the Ku Klux Klan Act. This law was a legal nuclear bomb. It gave the president the secret power to suspend habeas corpus, the right to be seen by a judge, and use the U.S. military to arrest terrorists without a warrant. Grant didn't hesitate. He sent the 7th Cavalry into South Carolina. They arrested thousands of Klan members. Federal prosecutors, some of the first in the newly formed Department of Justice, held massive secret trials. By 1872, the Klan was secretly broken. Its leaders fled, and its members went back into hiding. Grant had won the battle, proving that the federal government could stop terror if it had the will. But here's the secret the history books often miss. The Klan didn't disappear. It just changed its name. In the mid-1870s, new groups appeared: the White League and the Red Shirts. Unlike the Klan, these groups didn't wear masks. They were secretly supported by the wealthy elite and the Democratic Party. They practiced the Mississippi Plan. They didn't hide in the woods. They marched in broad daylight with rifles. They went to polling places and secretly intimidated voters, while the police looked the other way. They realized that they didn't need to be invisible if the North was too tired to keep sending soldiers. The most lasting hidden change of this era was the culture of silence. For the black community, the lesson of Section 3 was that the federal government's protection was temporary, but your neighbor's resentment was permanent. This era created a secret map of the South towns you couldn't enter after dark, roads you couldn't travel, and people you couldn't look in the eye. This secret geography of fear would eventually solidify into the Jim Crow system. The Invisible Empire may have lost its robes, but it had secretly successfully poisoned the well of Southern democracy. We must also mention the secret heroes who fought back. Black militias secretly organized to defend their homes. In South Carolina, black farmers formed rifle clubs to protect their families from night riders. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but their secret bravery is the reason Reconstruction lasted as long as it did. They fought a war that the rest of the country wanted to forget, standing as the last line of defense for the promise of the 14th Amendment. While the Klan was fighting a war in the shadows, a far more powerful revolution was happening in the light of the Southern state houses. This is the secret golden age of American democracy. Between 1867 and 1877, the South didn't just change, it became a laboratory for civil rights. For a brief window of time, the secret of the ballot gave power to the powerless, and the results were nothing short of a miracle. When the 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870, it secretly changed the math of American power. It didn't just give black men the right to vote, it created a massive new voting bloc that was 100% loyal to the party of Lincoln. In states like South Carolina, Mississippi, and Louisiana, black voters actually made up the majority of the electorate. Imagine the scene at the polling booths. Men who had once been whipped for learning to read were now casting ballots that would decide the next president of the United States. This secret surge of political energy led to the election of over 2,000 black officials at every level of government, from local constables and tax collectors to governors and senators. The most symbolic secret victory occurred in 1870. Hiram Revels, a minister and educator, was elected to the U.S. Senate by the Mississippi legislature. The hidden irony of his election was delicious. He was chosen to fill the seat vacated by Jefferson Davis, the man who had led the Confederacy. While Revels served 1 year, Blanche Gay Bruce followed shortly after, becoming the first black American to serve a full 6-year term in the Senate. These men weren't just tokens, they were sophisticated legislators. They fought for internal improvements, building levees, railroads, and telegraph lines, proving that black leadership wasn't just about civil rights. It was about building a modern nation. The real hidden change was happening in the state legislatures. For the first time, Southern governments were controlled by a coalition of black Southerners and Northern They did what the old Southern elite had secretly refused to do for a century. They built public schools. Before Reconstruction, the South had almost no public education for poor people, white or black. Education was for the rich. These new radical governments established the first state-funded school systems in the South. They also overhauled the tax codes, shifting the burden onto wealthy landowners and away from the poor. They built the first statron orphanages and mental health facilities. This was the secret modernization of the South. But there was a secret poison growing alongside this progress. The old Southern Eletha, plantocracy, watched in horror as their former laborers sat in the seats of power. They began to call themselves the Redeemers. Their secret strategy was the Mississippi Plan, or the White Line. They realized they didn't need to win arguments. They just needed to win elections by any means necessary. They secretly organized rifle clubs that weren't masks like the KKK, but were open, organized paramilitary groups. They would show up at Republican political rallies and secretly but very visibly point their rifles at the speakers. This was a secret coup in slow motion. The Redeemers used a secret weapon to turn the North against Reconstruction. The cry of corruption. It is true that some Reconstruction governments were involved in railroad scandals and financial mismanagement. But the secret was that corruption was happening everywhere in America during the Gilded Age, in the North, the West, and the South. The Redeemers used these scandals to argue that black men were incapable of governing. They secretly funded newspapers in New York and London to spread stories of black misrule. This propaganda was incredibly effective. It made Northern voters secretly wonder if Reconstruction was worth the cost and the headache. By 1874, a hidden shift occurred in the North. The generation of radical Republicans who had fought the war was dying out or retiring. A new generation of Republicans was more interested in the secret of the economy than the secret of civil rights. When a massive economic depression hit in 1873, the North lost interest in the South. They secretly began to pull funding from the Freedmen's Bureau. They stopped sending more troops to protect voters. The secret message to the South was, "We're tired of this. You figure it out." This was the beginning of the end for the Golden Age. Before the radical Republicans lost power, they passed one final secret masterpiece, the Civil Rights Act of 1875. This law was 100 years ahead of its time. It secretly banned discrimination in public accommodations, meaning hotels, theaters, and trains had to be open to everyone regardless of race. It was the high water mark of Reconstruction. But the secret tragedy was that the law was almost never enforced. The federal government didn't have the will, and the South ignored it. 8 years later, the Supreme Court would secretly strike it down, declaring it unconstitutional. It would take another 90 years for America to pass a similar law during the 1960s civil rights movement. The secret of the Golden Age is that it proved the American South could have been a multiracial democracy as early as 1870. The hidden change wasn't that the experiment failed because of the people involved. It failed because the rest of the country secretly decided that political peace and economic growth were more important than justice for 4 million people. By 1876, the United States was a powder keg. The country was exhausted. The North was tired of the Southern question, and the South was fueled by a secret rage to take back total control. This was the year of the Centennial America's 100th birthday, but instead of a celebration, the nation stood on the precipice of a second, even bloodier civil war. The secret of how this era ended is found in a smoke-filled room in a Washington, D.C. hotel, where the rights of 4 million people were traded away for a seat in the Oval Office. Tea election of 1876. The most corrupt vote in history. The election pitted Republican Rutherford B. Hayes against Democrat Samuel T. On election night, Tilden won the popular vote. He was one electoral vote away from the presidency. But there was a secret problem. 3 southern states, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, submitted to different sets of returns. In these states, the Redeemers and the White League had used massive secret violence to keep black voters away from the polls. The Republicans claimed the votes were fraudulent. The Democrats claimed they had won fair and square. For months, the United States had no president-elect. The secret fear was that on Inauguration Day, 2 different men would try to take the oath of office, and the army would have to choose a side. The Wormley Hotel. The secret deal-in. February 1877. The secret meeting took place at the Wormley Hotel in Washington. High-ranking members of both parties sat down to settle the dispute. The Democrats agreed to let Hayes, the Republican, become president, but the secret price was devastating. The Republicans had to agree to 3 things. 1. Withdraw all remaining federal troops from the South. 2. Appoint a Southerner to the cabinet. 3. Provide federal money for Southern railroads. This was the compromise of 1877. The hidden truth of this deal was that it effectively handed the keys of the South back to the very men who had started the Civil War. The federal government secretly washed its hands of the responsibility to protect its black citizens. The last soldier leaves. The lights go out in April 1877. President Hayes ordered the last federal troops to leave the state houses in Columbia, South Carolina, and New Orleans. As the soldiers marched out, the secret protection for black Americans vanished. One black politician at the time famously said, "The sun went down on our people that day." Almost instantly, the Redeemer governments moved to dismantle the progress of the last decade. They secretly rewrote state constitutions to include poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses, all designed to strip the vote from black men without technically violating the 15th Amendment. The birth of Jim Crow. The hidden prison with the federal government no longer watching, the South built a new secret system of social control, Jim Crow. This wasn't just about separate water fountains. It was about secretly re-establishing a racial caste system. They used the vagrancy laws we mentioned earlier to funnel thousands of black men into convict leasing. This was the secret of the chain gang. Private companies would rent prisoners from the state to work in coal mines and on railroads. These men were treated worse than slaves because, unlike a slave, a rented prisoner had no value to the owner once the day was over. If they died, the state simply provided another one. This was the hidden heart of the New South. The Plessy v. Ferguson secret. Legalizing inequality. Final nail in the coffin of Reconstruction came in 1896 with the Plessy v. Ferguson Supreme Court case. The court secretly validated the entire Southern system by declaring that separate but equal was constitutional. The hidden lie was that it was never equal. For the next 60 years, the secret of Reconstruction was buried under a mountain of segregation, disenfranchisement, and state-sanctioned violence. The Second Revolution had been defeated not by the sword, but by a lack of will and a legal pen. The lingering shadows. Reconstruction today. Why does this secret history matter in 2026? Because we are still living in the echoes of 1877. The debates we see today about voting rights, police reform, and the power of the federal government are the exact same debates that were left unfinished when the troops left the South. The hidden change of Reconstruction was that it gave America a glimpse of what it could be a truly multiracial democracy, even though it was suppressed. That secret dream didn't die. It lived on in the kitchens and churches of the South, fueling the fire that would eventually become the 1960s civil rights movement. On paper, maybe, the secret deal of 1877 tried to bury the progress of a decade under the dust of history. The Redeemers tried to erase the names of the black senators and the radical teachers. They wanted us to believe that the war ended at Appomattox, and that everything after was just a mistake. But they were wrong. Reconstruction was not a failure. It was a revelation. It proved that freedom is not a gift, it is a constant, grueling struggle. It showed that the secret of America isn't found in its politicians, but in the ordinary people who stood in line for hours to vote for the first time, who built schools in the middle of burned-out ruins, and who dared to believe that equal protection meant everyone. The soldiers left. The masks returned. The shadows grew long. But the 14th and 15th Amendments remained in the constitutional-like secret. Time bombs, waiting for a future generation to ignite them. The story of Reconstruction is a reminder that progress is not a straight line. It is a zigzag of triumph and betrayal. But the biggest secret of all is the war for the soul of the nation never truly ended.